Just a storm that could kill you in hours. No fire, no shelter, no raincoat. Yet native tribes survived it with techniques so simple, so brilliant, you'll wonder why we stopped using them. This isn't survival theory. This is knowledge burned into muscle memory over thousands of years. Knowledge that kept people alive when the sky turned black and the rain fell for days. Knowledge that didn't need Gore-Tex or nylon or a credit card. Are you ready to discover 7 Native American tricks to keep clothing dry without shelter? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to learn might just save your life. For thousands of years, the original peoples of this continent moved through climates that would break modern humans in days. They crossed frozen tundras where rain turned to ice on contact. They walked through temperate forests where storms arrived without warning and lasted for weeks. They traveled coastal regions where fog never lifted and the air itself was wet. And they did it without the things we think we need. They had no waterproof jackets, no synthetic fabrics, no Ziploc bags or tarps or plastic ponchos. What they had was observation, experimentation, generations of lived experience passed down through story, through demonstration, through doing. They watched the animals, they studied the plants, they listened to the wind and the water and the seasons. And from that listening, they developed methods so effective that many are still used today by those who remember. This is their knowledge. These are their methods, and these are the 7 techniques that kept them dry when the world was drowning. Natural oil and fat waterproofing. The hide lies stretched across the frame, pale and clean, drying in the autumn sun. But it isn't finished yet. The woman approaches with a bowl made from a section of birch bark. Inside the bowl is a substance that looks like rendered lard, pale yellow and soft. It smells faintly of wood smoke and something else. Something wild and animal and old. Bare fat. She dips her fingers into it and begins to work the fat into the surface of the hide with slow circular motions. Her hands move with the confidence of someone who has done this 1,000 times. The fat disappears into the leather, darkening it slightly, making it gleam. This is one of the oldest waterproofing methods known to the continent. Bare fat, buffalo tallow, seal oil, fish oil, deer brain paste mixed with fat. The specific substance varied by region, by tribe, by what animals were available. But the principle was universal. Animal fat creates a barrier that water cannot easily penetrate. The chemistry is simple but effective. Fat molecules are hydrophobic. They repel water. When rubbed into the porous surface of tanned hide, they fill the microscopic spaces between fibers. Rain hits the surface and beads up instead of soaking through. The fat doesn't make the material completely waterproof, but it slows water penetration dramatically. And it does something else too. It keeps the leather supple. Untreated buckskin, when it gets wet and dries again, becomes stiff as cardboard. It cracks. It loses its flexibility. But fat-treated leather stays soft even after multiple wettings. The fat conditions the fibers, keeping them pliable, keeping them alive. The Inuit used seal oil for this purpose. Rich, thick, potent. They would rub it into their winter clothing, their boots, their mittens. The oil had the added benefit of providing extra insulation. When the temperature dropped to 40 below, that thin layer of oil could mean the difference between frostbite and survival. Plains tribes used buffalo tallow, rendered down from the great animals that sustained their entire way of life. Every part of the buffalo was used, and the fat was no exception. It was precious. It was stored carefully in bladder pouches. It was applied not just to clothing, but to rawhide containers, to bowstrings, to anything that needed protection from moisture. Coastal tribes had access to fish oil, salmon, eulachon, seal. The eulachon, sometimes called the candlefish, was so rich in oil that it could be dried and burned like a candle. That same oil, when applied to cedar bark capes and woven hats, turned them into effective rain gear. The application process was methodical. First, the hide had to be clean and fully tanned. Then it was warmed slightly, either by the sun or by a low fire, so the pores would open. The fat was warmed too, until it was soft and easy to work with. Then it was massaged into the leather, worked in until the surface couldn't absorb anymore. Sometimes the hide was then smoked, which we'll discuss later. Sometimes it was simply hung to dry, allowing the fat to set into the fibers. The result was a material that could shed light rain for hours and moderate rain for a significant amount of time. It wasn't perfect. In a prolonged downpour, water would eventually penetrate, but it bought time. And in survival situations, time is everything. This wasn't a technique reserved for special garments. It was standard practice. Everyday clothing was treated this way. Moccasins were treated this way. Even baby carriers and cradle boards were rubbed with fat to protect the infant inside from dampness. The knowledge of which fats worked best, how much to apply, when to reapply, this was passed down through generations. It was taught by doing. A child would watch their mother or grandmother treat a hide, and then they would try it themselves, guided by patient hands. And when that child grew and had children of their own, they would pass the knowledge forward again. This is how survival knowledge survives, not in books, not in manuals, in hands, in muscle memory, in the quiet repetition of necessary work. The woman finishes treating the hide and steps back. The leather gleams softly in the fading light, ready now to face the rain, ready to protect the person who will wear it, ready to do what it was made to do. Bark fiber overlayers. The forest floor is soft with centuries of fallen needles. The man moves through the cedar grove with purpose, his eyes scanning the trunks. He's looking for something specific, a tree with bark that's thick but not too thick, a tree that's healthy, a tree that will give what he needs without dying. He finds it. The cedar stands tall, its bark fibrous and reddish-brown, peeling in long vertical strips. He carries no metal tools, only a sharpened bone blade and a wedge made from antler. He makes a vertical cut, careful and precise, then begins to work the wedge behind the bark. Slowly, patiently, he peels away a section as long as his arm. This is cedar bark, one of the most versatile materials the forest provides, and it's about to become rain gear. Bark fiber overlayers were used extensively by tribes of the Pacific Northwest, the Salish, the Tlinet, the Haida, the Nuchanolth. In a region where rain is not a season but a way of life, where the sky is gray more often than blue, staying dry wasn't optional. It was survival. Cedar bark, when processed correctly, becomes something extraordinary. The man takes the bark back to camp and begins the transformation. First, he soaks it in water to make it pliable. Then he pounds it with a wooden mallet, beating it until the fibers separate and soften. The bark becomes almost fabric-like, still tough, but now flexible, almost like heavy cloth. This processed bark can be woven, braided, layered, or simply worn as large overlapping sheets. Women wore cedar bark capes that hung from the shoulders down to the knees, covering the body like a natural poncho. The bark was often woven into a loose mat with overlapping strips, so that rain would hit the top layer and run off before penetrating to the skin. The genius of bark fiber is in its structure. When bark gets wet, the fibers swell. As they swell, they press together, creating a tighter weave, a denser barrier. The wetter it gets, the more waterproof it becomes. It's a self-regulating system, designed by nature, refined by human hands. Cedar wasn't the only bark used. In the Northeast, birch bark was prized. Thin sheets of birch bark could be layered over clothing or fashioned into temporary rain shields. Birch bark is naturally water-resistant because of oils in the bark itself. It's why birch bark canoes didn't leak, why they could carry families and all their possessions across vast lakes without sinking. Elm bark, when processed, could also be used. Spruce roots, though technically not bark, were often woven into rain hats with such tight weaves that water simply rolled off. The hats themselves were works of art. Conical, woven from spruce root or cedar bark, sometimes decorated with painted designs or woven patterns. They weren't just functional, they were beautiful. They announced identity, lineage, skill. A well-made rain hat was a point of pride. But beyond aesthetics, these hats worked. Rain would hit the broad, sloped surface and run off in streams, away from the face, away from the shoulders. Combined with a cedar bark cape, a person could walk through a storm and arrive nearly dry. The layering principle was key. Bark fiber wasn't worn directly against the skin. It was an outer layer, a sacrificial shell that took the brunt of the rain. Underneath, people wore softer materials: buckskin, woven plant fiber, fur. The bark kept the inner layers dry, and the inner layers kept the body warm. This is the same principle modern rain gear uses: an outer waterproof shell with insulating layers beneath. But this version required no factories, no petroleum products, no global supply chains. It required a forest, a sharp tool, and knowledge. The knowledge of which trees to harvest from without killing them. The knowledge of when the bark peels easiest, in spring, when the sap is running. The knowledge of how to process it, how to soften it, how to weave it or layer it for maximum protection. This knowledge wasn't written down. It was taught in the forest, with hands on bark, with the teacher guiding the students' movements. It was learned by watching, by trying, by failing and trying again. And it was effective. Coastal tribes could travel for days in constant rain, wearing their bark fiber gear, and stay dry enough to avoid hypothermia. That's not a small thing. Hypothermia is one of the fastest killers in wet, cold environments. The ability to manage moisture, to keep the core body temperature stable, is the difference between life and death. The man finishes pounding the cedar bark. It's soft now, almost cloth-like. He folds it carefully and sets it aside to dry. Tomorrow he'll weave it into a cape, and when the rains come, as they always do, he'll walk through them as his ancestors did, protected by the forest itself. Pause for a moment and think about the last time you were caught in the rain without shelter. What would you have done if you had to stay dry using only what the forest provided? Drop your thoughts below, because the techniques we're about to explore go even deeper. Fur outward technique. The cold is absolute. The kind of cold that makes the air itself feel brittle, like it could shatter if you move too fast. The kind of cold where breath freezes instantly into tiny ice crystals that fall to the ground like snow. And in this cold, a figure moves across the frozen landscape. They are wrapped head to toe in fur, but the fur doesn't face inward toward the skin the way most modern people would assume. It faces outward, hair side out. This is one of the most counterintuitive and brilliant clothing techniques ever developed. The Inuit understood it, the Cree understood it, the Dene, the Gwich'in, the Yupik, all the northern peoples understood it. Fur worn with the hair facing out doesn't just keep you warm, it keeps you dry. Here's why. When rain or snow hits fur that's oriented hair side out, it lands on individual hairs, not on skin or hide. Each hair is coated with natural oils, the same oils that keep animals dry in the wild. Water beads up on these hairs and rolls off, just like rain rolling off a duck's back. The hairs act like thousands of tiny umbrellas. If you were to reverse the fur, wearing it hair side in, the water would strike the leather side directly. Leather, even treated leather, will eventually absorb water. Once it's wet, it becomes cold. Cold leather against your skin is a fast path to hypothermia, but with the fur facing out, the hide stays dry. The hair sheds the moisture before it ever reaches the skin. There's another advantage too. When snow falls on outward-facing fur, it doesn't melt immediately from body heat. It stays as snow, sitting on top of the fur layer. Snow is an excellent insulator. A layer of snow on fur clothing actually increases warmth. The Inuit knew this intimately. Their winter parkas, called anorak or atigi depending on the region, were made from caribou fur, seal fur, or polar bear fur, always worn hair side out. The hood was lined with wolverine or wolf fur around the face, because those furs don't collect frost from breath the way other furs do. Every detail was intentional. The parka was cut loose, not tight, to allow air circulation and prevent sweat buildup. Sweat is dangerous in extreme cold. It dampens clothing, which then freezes. A loose-fitting fur garment allows moisture to escape while still trapping warm air close to the body. The Cree and Ojibwe used a similar approach with their winter clothing, though their environment was less extreme. They wore moose hide and deer hide garments with the fur left on, hair facing out. In wet, cold forests, where freezing rain was common, this technique kept them dry and mobile. Compare this to early European explorers in the Arctic. They wore wool, which is warm when dry but becomes a cold, heavy sponge when wet. They wore tightly fitted clothing that didn't breathe. They sweated and their clothing froze to their skin. Many died. Meanwhile, indigenous peoples in the same environment thrived, protected by fur garments that worked with the environment instead of against it. The preparation of these garments was an art form. First, the hide had to be carefully skinned so the fur remained intact. Then it was scraped clean of fat and membrane, a painstaking process done with scrapers made from bone or stone. The hide was then stretched and dried, sometimes smoked, sometimes treated with brain tanning to keep it soft. The sewing was precise. Sinew thread, made from animal tendons, was used because it's incredibly strong, and when wet, it swells slightly, sealing the stitch holes and making the seams water-resistant. Seams were often placed strategically, not at the shoulders where rain would run, but offset so water had no easy path through. Some garments had double layers of fur, an inner layer with the hair facing in for softness and warmth, and an outer layer with the hair facing out for weather protection. This created an air gap between the two layers, an added pocket of insulation. The result was a garment that could withstand the harshest conditions on Earth. People wearing these clothes could hunt in blizzards. They could travel for days across frozen tundra. They could survive nights in the open when temperatures dropped to 50 below zero. And they could do it while staying dry, because the fur was facing the right direction. Such a simple thing. Hair side out instead of hair side in. But that simple reversal represents generations of observation, of trial and error, of learning from the animals themselves, because animals already knew. Every mammal that survives in cold, wet climates has fur that faces outward, that sheds water, that insulates. Humans just had to pay attention, and the northern peoples did. They watched the caribou shake off snow. They watched the wolf emerge from a river and shake itself dry in seconds. They watched the seal surface in icy water, its fur barely wet beneath the surface layer. And they learned. They took those lessons and applied them, creating clothing that mimicked the natural adaptations of the animals around them. This is biomimicry in its purest form, not a modern invention, but an ancient practice, born from necessity and refined over millennia. The figure continues across the frozen plain, fur gleaming with frost, breath trailing behind in white plumes. The storm doesn't touch them. The cold doesn't reach them. They are protected by knowledge older than metal, older than agriculture, older than cities. They are protected by fur, facing the world the way it was meant to. Layered buckskin drying system. The rain has been falling for 3 days straight. Not a hard rain, but a persistent drizzle, the kind that seeps into everything, that turns the ground to mud, that makes fire difficult and sleep uncomfortable. But the traveler keeps moving. Their clothing is buckskin, layered in a specific way, and though the outer layer is damp, they are not cold. They are not shivering. Their core temperature remains stable. This is the layered buckskin drying system. Buckskin, tanned deer hide, has properties that made it one of the most valued materials across the continent. It's soft, flexible, durable, and breathable. But its most remarkable quality, the one that made it essential for wet weather travel, is this. Buckskin dries from the inside out. When buckskin gets wet, it doesn't become cold and clammy the way cotton or wool does. It stays relatively warm, and as your body heat radiates through it, the moisture migrates outward, evaporating from the surface while the inner layers stay dry against your skin. This isn't magic, it's physics. Buckskin is porous. It allows air and moisture to pass through in both directions. When you're wearing it, your body heat creates a temperature gradient, warm on the inside, cooler on the outside. Moisture naturally moves along that gradient from warm to cool, from inside to outside. The result is a self-drying garment. But to maximize this effect, indigenous peoples developed a layering system. The outer layer is sacrificial. It's the layer that takes the rain, that gets wet, that acts as a buffer between the storm and your body. It's cut loose so it doesn't cling, so water can run off. Beneath that is a second layer, also buckskin, but treated differently, often smoked or oil treated for added water resistance. This middle layer provides insulation and catches any moisture that makes it through the outer layer. The innermost layer, worn next to the skin, is the softest buckskin, brain tanned to incredible suppleness. This layer is almost always kept dry by the two outer layers. As you move, as your body generates heat, the system works. The outer layer sheds most of the rain. What little moisture penetrates is absorbed by the middle layer or evaporates before it reaches your skin. And your body heat constantly dries the inner surface of all three layers. It's a dynamic system, constantly adjusting, constantly working. Movement is key. If you stand still in layered buckskin during a rainstorm, you'll eventually get wet. But if you keep moving, walking, working, traveling, your body generates enough heat to drive the drying process. The more you move, the better it works. This is why hunters and scouts could travel for days in wet conditions without changing clothes. They understood that the clothing was doing its job as long as they kept moving. They didn't need to stop and dry their garments by a fire, though they would if they had the opportunity. They could simply keep going, trusting the system, trusting the buckskin, trusting the knowledge that had kept their people alive for generations. The buckskin itself had to be prepared correctly for this system to work. Brain tanning was the preferred method. Every animal has enough brains to tan its own hide. This is a teaching passed down across many tribes. The brain matter contains oils and enzymes that, when worked into the hide, break down the collagen and create a leather that's soft, durable, and breathable. The process is labor-intensive. First, the hide is fleshed, all fat and membrane removed. Then it's soaked, wrung out, and worked with a mixture of the animal's brains and warm water. The hide is stretched and pulled repeatedly, sometimes over a smooth log, sometimes by hand. This stretching, done while the hide is damp, is what makes buckskin soft. Then comes smoking. The hide is hung in a tipi-like structure over a smoldering fire, usually rotten wood, which produces cool smoke rather than hot flames. The smoke permeates the hide, adding water resistance and preventing the leather from stiffening if it gets wet again. A properly smoked buckskin can get soaked, dry out, and return to its original softness. An unsmoked hide will dry stiff as cardboard. This smoking process is what makes the layered system truly effective. Each layer of buckskin, smoked and supple, works in concert with the others. Water penetrates slowly, if at all. Body heat drives continuous drying. The wearer stays warm and functional, even in prolonged wet conditions. Contrast this with modern cotton clothing. Cotton absorbs water rapidly. Once wet, it loses almost all insulating value. It becomes heavy, cold, and stays wet for hours. In cold, wet conditions, cotton is often called death cloth by survival instructors. Buckskin, on the other hand, maintains warmth even when damp. It dries actively as long as you're moving. It breathes, preventing the buildup of sweat that can lead to hypothermia. The traveler pauses on a ridge, looking out over the rain-soaked valley. Their outer layer is dark with moisture, but underneath, against their skin, everything is dry. They're warm. They're comfortable. They adjust the strap of their pack and continue down the trail. The rain keeps falling. It doesn't matter. The prairie stretches in every direction, an ocean of grass under a heavy gray sky. The rain starts as a whisper, then builds to a steady rhythm, soaking the grass, turning the earth dark. And the runner keeps moving. They've been traveling since dawn, carrying messages between camps, and they won't stop until the message is delivered. But they're not worried about the rain. They're prepared. Beneath their buckskin shirt, packed between the outer garment and their skin, is a thick layer of dried prairie grass. This is the grass padding absorption method. It's simple, almost absurdly simple, but it works. Dry grass, cattail fluff, milkweed down, shredded cedar bark, even dried moss. These materials were used as insulating and moisture-absorbing layers worn directly under outer clothing. The principle is straightforward. The grass absorbs water before it reaches your skin. When rain penetrates the outer layer of clothing, instead of soaking through to your body, it's caught by the grass padding. The grass can hold a surprising amount of moisture while still maintaining some insulating value. And because it's organic and fibrous, it doesn't conduct cold the way wet fabric does. This technique was especially popular among hunters, scouts, and travelers who needed to move fast and couldn't afford to be weighed down by heavy layered clothing. The grass used had to be completely dry when packed. Wet grass would do more harm than good. It would chill the body and promote hypothermia. But dry grass, carefully harvested and prepared, became a portable, replaceable insulation system. Before a journey, a traveler would gather the softest grass they could find. Prairie grass, if available, was ideal because of its length and fineness. Cattail down, the fluffy seed material from cattail plants, was even better because it's incredibly lightweight and absorbs moisture readily. The grass was packed loosely around the torso, sometimes held in place by a thin inner shirt or simply tucked into the waistband. It created a buffer zone between the outer weather and the skin. As the day progressed, if the outer clothing got wet, the grass would begin to absorb that moisture. The wearer could feel it getting damp, but their skin stayed dry. And as long as their core stayed warm, they could keep moving. At the end of the day, the wet grass was simply removed and discarded. Fresh, dry grass was packed in for the next day. It was a renewable resource available almost everywhere except the deepest winter or the driest deserts. In winter, this technique took on additional importance. Dried grass packed into moccasins provided insulation against frozen ground. It absorbed foot sweat, which if left unchecked would freeze and cause frostbite. Hunters would carry extra grass with them, changing it out during the day to keep their feet dry and warm. The same principle applied to mittens and inside sleeping robes. Some tribes used milkweed down for this purpose. Milkweed produces a silky, fibrous fluff attached to its seeds. This fluff is hydrophobic. It repels water naturally. Packed into clothing, it provided both insulation and moisture management. The Anishinaabe people called milkweed silk of the prairie and used it extensively for bedding and cold weather clothing inserts. Cedar bark, when shredded fine, was another option, especially in forested regions. It had natural oils that repelled moisture and a pleasant scent. Packed inside clothing, it provided a layer of protection and comfort. Dried moss, particularly sphagnum moss, was used by northern tribes. Sphagnum is incredibly absorbent. It can hold up to 20 times its weight in water. It was used not just for rain protection, but also for menstrual pads, baby diapers, and wound dressings. Packed inside clothing during wet weather, moss would absorb moisture and could be wrung out and reused if necessary. This absorption method wasn't a replacement for waterproof outer layers. It was a supplement, an additional line of defense, a way to manage moisture that inevitably made it through the outer shell. But in combination with other techniques, oil-treated buckskin, fur outward clothing, bark fiber capes, the grass padding method made the difference between wet discomfort and life-threatening cold. The runner crests a hill and sees smoke rising in the distance, the camp they're heading for. They've been running for hours in steady rain, but they're not hypothermic. They're not shivering. The grass padding beneath their shirt has done its job, absorbing the moisture that seeped through, keeping their core warm and dry. When they arrive at camp, they'll remove the damp grass, hang their outer shirt to dry by the fire, and pack fresh grass for tomorrow's journey. It's a system that requires no advanced technology, just observation, just knowledge of what grows around you and how it behaves when wet, just the wisdom to use what the land provides. Smoke curing waterproofing. The smoke rises in a steady column, thick and white, smelling of damp wood and thyme. Inside the smoke lodge, hides hang from wooden frames, suspended over a carefully controlled fire. The fire isn't burning hot. It's smoldering, producing maximum smoke with minimum heat. This is smoke curing, and it's one of the most important weatherproofing techniques ever developed. Smoke does something remarkable to leather. It changes it at a molecular level, making it water-resistant, preventing it from stiffening when wet, and giving it a durability that untreated hide simply doesn't have. The chemistry is complex, but the practice is ancient. When hide is exposed to smoke over time, compounds in the smoke, primarily phenols and formaldehyde from the burning wood, bond with the collagen fibers in the leather. These compounds fill the microscopic spaces between fibers and create a barrier that repels water. The result is leather that can get soaked and still return to its original softness once dried. This was crucial for survival. Untreated rawhide, when it gets wet, becomes soft and stretchy. When it dries, it becomes hard as wood and brittle. A rawhide garment subjected to repeated wetting and drying cycles would quickly become unwearable. But smoke-cured leather stays supple through countless wet-dry cycles. The smoking process varied by region and tribe, but the basic method was consistent. First, the hide was tanned, usually through brain tanning, to make it soft and workable. Then it was sewn into a tube or cone shape, like a bag, and suspended over a smoldering fire inside a specially constructed lodge or teepee. The fire was fed with rotten wood, which burns cool and produces thick smoke. Hardwoods were often preferred. Some tribes used specific woods for specific purposes: willow for a light smoke, cottonwood for a heavier cure. The hide would hang in the smoke for hours, sometimes days, depending on the desired level of waterproofing. As the smoke penetrated the leather, the color changed. Pale white or cream leather would turn golden, then tan, then eventually a rich brown. The darker the color, the heavier the smoke cure, the more water-resistant the leather. The person tending the fire had to maintain the perfect balance. Too much heat would cook the leather, making it stiff. Too little smoke and the cure wouldn't penetrate. It required constant attention, constant adjustment, constant knowledge. Women were often the keepers of this knowledge, though men participated as well. It was taught by doing, by watching the smoke, by feeling the leather, by knowing when it was done. A properly smoked hide had a distinctive smell: earthy, slightly sweet, unmistakable. It would remain soft even after getting soaked and drying multiple times. Water would beat on the surface rather than soaking in immediately. This technique was applied to nearly all leather goods. Moccasins were heavily smoked because they were in constant contact with wet ground. Shirts and leggings were smoked for rain protection. Bags and pouches were smoked to keep their contents dry. Even teepee covers were smoked, which made them more resistant to rain and less likely to rot. The smoke curing also had preservative effects. It inhibited the growth of mold and bacteria, which meant leather goods lasted longer, even in damp conditions. A smoked hide could be stored for years without deteriorating. This was especially important for nomadic peoples who needed their possessions to be durable and long-lasting. Some tribes combined smoking with oil treatment for maximum waterproofing. The hide would be smoked first, then rubbed with animal fat while still warm from the smoke. The combination created a nearly waterproof surface that could shed rain for extended periods. European colonizers were amazed by indigenous leather goods. They noted in their journals that native clothing could withstand weather that destroyed European fabrics. They observed that buckskin stayed soft even after being soaked, while their own woolen clothing became stiff and uncomfortable. Some Europeans adopted the technique themselves, learning from indigenous peoples how to smoke-cure leather. It became a standard practice among frontier settlers, trappers, and mountain men. But the knowledge originated here, in smoke lodges across the continent, tended by hands that understood fire and smoke and hide, refined over generations into a technique so effective, it's still used today by traditional craftspeople and survival instructors. The hides hanging in the smoke lodge turn slowly in the rising heat. The fire crackles softly beneath them, patient and persistent. Outside, the rain has started again, drumming on the roof, turning the world gray and wet. But inside the lodge, leather is being transformed, made ready, made resilient, made capable of facing the rain and emerging unchanged. The wind sweeps across the open plain, constant and strong, carrying the scent of rain and sage. The messenger runs into it, leaning forward slightly, letting the wind catch the fabric of their clothing, letting it pull and tug and flap. They're not running from the wind, they're using it. This is the principle of wind and movement drying, the simplest and perhaps most elegant moisture management technique of all. Moving air accelerates evaporation. It's basic physics. When air moves across a wet surface, it carries away the water molecules that are evaporating from that surface. The faster the air moves, the faster the evaporation. Indigenous runners, scouts, hunters, and travelers understood this instinctively. They knew that if they kept moving, especially in windy conditions. Their clothing would dry as they traveled. They didn't need to stop. They didn't need to build a fire. They just needed to keep the air moving across their wet garments. The technique involves strategy. If you were traveling in rain with a strong wind, you would orient yourself so the wind hit your back or side rather than your face. This served two purposes. It made breathing easier, and it allowed the wind to strip moisture from your clothing. The fabric would flap and billow in the wind. Each gust pulled moisture out of the fibers and carried it away. As you moved, your body heat accelerated the process, warming the fabric from the inside while the wind cooled and dried it from the outside. Loose-fitting clothing was essential for this technique to work. Tight clothing, pressed against the skin, couldn't catch the wind, couldn't flap and move and dry. But loose garments, shirts cut full, leggings worn loosely, capes that hung free, these caught the wind like sails and dried rapidly. This is one reason why so much traditional native clothing was cut loose rather than fitted. It wasn't a matter of style or fashion, it was functional. Loose clothing allowed air circulation, prevented sweat buildup, and took advantage of wind for drying. Runners were the masters of this technique. Messages had to be carried between villages, between tribes, across vast distances. These messengers ran for hours, sometimes days, in all weather conditions. They couldn't afford to be weighed down by wet clothing or slowed by hypothermia. So they wore lightweight buckskin, cut loose, and they ran with the wind. If caught in rain, they would keep running. The combination of their movement, their body heat, and the wind would dry their clothing as they traveled. By the time they reached their destination, they might be damp but not dangerously wet. Hunters used a similar approach. A deer hunter might spend all day in light rain, stalking through wet forest. But they would keep moving, slowly and deliberately, and their clothing would manage the moisture through constant air circulation and the subtle drying effect of their movement through the brush. They learned to read the wind, to feel when it shifted, when it picked up, when to pause in a clearing and let the wind do its work. There was an art to this, knowing when to face into the wind and when to turn your back, knowing how to position your arms to let air flow through your clothing, knowing how to use terrain, standing on ridges where the wind was strongest, avoiding low valleys where the air was still and heavy. Some tribes developed specific movements and postures that maximized wind drying. A person might stop periodically, raise their arms, and turn in a slow circle, letting the wind reach every part of their body. Or they might shake their garments vigorously, breaking up water droplets and exposing fresh surface area to the air. These weren't random movements. They were deliberate techniques, taught and practiced, refined through experience. The effectiveness of wind drying depended on several factors. Wind speed was the most obvious. Stronger wind meant faster drying, but humidity mattered too. In dry climates, even gentle wind could dry clothing quickly. In humid coastal regions, wind drying was less effective, though still better than no movement at all. Temperature played a role as well. Warm wind dried clothing faster than cold wind, but even cold wind was better than still air, because the movement prevented moisture from settling and freezing. This technique was often combined with others. A traveler might wear smoke-cured buckskin treated with animal fat, packed with grass padding, and covered with a bark fiber cape. But they would still rely on movement and wind as the primary drying mechanism, letting all the other techniques work together as a system. The beauty of wind and movement drying is that it requires no materials, no preparation, no special knowledge. It requires only awareness, awareness of your body, awareness of the wind, awareness of how moisture behaves and how to work with it rather than against it. This is the kind of knowledge that can't be written in a book and fully understood. It has to be experienced. You have to feel the wind pulling moisture from your shirt. You have to notice how your pace affects the drying rate. You have to learn through trial and error how to position yourself, how to move, how to use the air itself as a tool. Indigenous peoples learned this through necessity. They spent their entire lives outdoors, in all weather, in all seasons. They couldn't escape the rain. They couldn't call for rescue. They had to adapt, to understand, to work with what they had. And what they had was movement and wind and their own body heat. That was enough. The messenger crests another rise, their clothing flapping in the strong wind. And they can feel it, the dampness pulling away, the fabric lightening, the cold edge of wet cloth fading. They don't slow down. They don't stop to assess. They just keep running because they know that as long as they keep moving, as long as the wind keeps blowing, they'll stay ahead of the cold. They'll arrive at their destination not warm and perfectly dry, but functional, capable, alive, and in survival. That's all that matters. Putting it all together, the storm arrives at dusk, rolling across the mountains like a dark wall. The traveler has been watching it all day, seeing it build on the horizon, knowing it would reach them eventually. They've been preparing. They wear a system, not just clothing, but a carefully constructed defense against the weather. This is what it looks like when all the techniques come together. The base layer, worn against the skin, is soft, brain-tanned buckskin, smoked until it's the color of honey. This layer is loose, allowing air circulation, preventing sweat buildup. It's been treated with a thin coating of deer fat, rubbed in and allowed to set, creating a subtle water-resistant barrier. Between this base layer and the outer layer, dried prairie grass is packed loosely, not thick enough to restrict movement, but enough to absorb moisture and provide additional insulation. The outer layer is heavier buckskin, more heavily smoked, darker in color. It's been treated with bear fat, creating a surface that sheds light rain. This layer is cut even looser than the base, allowing maximum airflow and wind drying. Over everything, a cedar bark cape hangs from the shoulders, its woven fibers overlapping like scales. The cape extends down to the thighs, covering the torso and upper legs. When rain hits it, the bark fibers swell and tighten, becoming more water-resistant the wetter they get. The final piece is a fur hat, made from wolf pelt, worn with the hair facing outward. Rain beads on the fur and runs off. Snow sits on top without melting. The fur keeps the head warm and dry, which helps regulate the entire body's temperature. This is a complete system. Each element works independently, but together they create something far more effective than any single technique alone. When the storm hits, the rain comes hard and cold, driven by wind that cuts across the open ground. The traveler doesn't seek shelter. They keep walking. The rain hits the cedar bark cape first, running in streams off the overlapping fibers. Some moisture penetrates, but the outer buckskin layer catches it. The bear fat coating causes it to bead and roll rather than soak through. What little moisture makes it past the outer buckskin is absorbed by the grass padding. The traveler can feel it getting damp against their ribs, but their skin stays dry. The base layer, smoke-cured and slightly oiled, provides a final barrier. If any moisture reaches it, it doesn't penetrate easily. And the traveler's body heat, trapped by the layering system, keeps everything warm enough that cold never becomes dangerous. The traveler adjusts their pace, angling slightly to put the wind at their back. The loose clothing catches the wind and flaps, accelerating the drying of any damp spots. Movement generates additional body heat, which radiates through the system, driving moisture outward. After an hour of walking in heavy rain, the traveler is not comfortable. Comfort isn't the goal, but they are functional. Their core temperature is stable. They're not shivering. They're not hypothermic. They can keep going as long as they need to. This is what indigenous peoples understood. Survival isn't about staying perfectly dry and comfortable. It's about staying functional, about maintaining core temperature, about being able to keep moving, keep working, keep living even when the weather turns hostile. The techniques we've explored aren't about luxury or convenience. They're about survival in the most fundamental sense, staying alive when the environment is actively trying to kill you. And they work. They worked for thousands of years across every climate and environment on this continent. They worked in the frozen Arctic, where a single mistake meant death. They worked in temperate forests where rain fell for weeks. They worked on open plains where storms arrived without warning. They worked because they were based on deep observation of the natural world. Every technique mimics something found in nature. The oil coating mimics the oils on animal fur. The bark fiber cape mimics the overlapping structure of bird feathers or fish scales. The fur outward technique copies what every wild animal already does. The smoke curing replicates the preservative effect of natural forest fires. Indigenous peoples didn't invent these techniques from nothing. They learned them by watching, by studying, by asking, how does that deer stay dry in the rain? How does that wolf emerge from the river and shake itself nearly dry? How does that bird shed water so effectively? And then they applied those observations to their own survival. This is the genius of traditional knowledge. It's not separate from nature, imposed upon the world through force or technology. It's derived from nature, working with natural principles rather than against them. The storm continues through the night, but the traveler finds a place to rest, a rocky overhang that provides minimal shelter. They remove the damp grass padding and hang the outer layers to air out. The cedar bark cape is wrung out and set aside. By morning, everything has dried enough to wear again. The system resets. Ready for another day. This is sustainable technology. It requires no factories, no fossil fuels, no global supply chains. It can be made from materials found within walking distance. It can be repaired with basic tools. When it wears out, it returns to the earth without leaving toxic residue, and it works as well today as it did 1,000 years ago. The principles haven't changed. Physics hasn't changed. Water still evaporates. Wind still dries. Oil still repels moisture. Smoke still preserves leather. What has changed is that most people have forgotten these principles exist. We've outsourced our survival to industrial systems that require massive infrastructure to maintain. We've become dependent on synthetic materials that work brilliantly until they don't, until you're in a situation where replacement or repair isn't possible. Indigenous knowledge offers an alternative, not a romantic return to some imagined past, but a practical reminder that humans survived for millennia with techniques that were elegant, effective, and sustainable. The traveler emerges from the overhang as dawn breaks. The storm has passed. The sky is clearing. They pack their gear, adjust their clothing, and continue on their way. Behind them, the landscape is fresh and clean, washed by rain. Ahead, the path continues, leading wherever it needs to lead. And the traveler walks it, protected by knowledge, sustained by tradition, carrying techniques that have kept people alive since time before memory. The rain will always come. The cold will always find you. The wind will always blow. These are constants, unchangeable, as old as the earth itself. What changes is how we meet them. The original peoples of this land didn't conquer the weather. They didn't try to dominate it or control it or pretend it didn't exist. They learned to live with it. They developed techniques so effective, so refined, so deeply rooted in observation and experience, that they could walk through storms that would kill unprepared people in hours. They could cross frozen landscapes. They could travel through endless rain. They could maintain body temperature and functionality in conditions that would break modern humans equipped with the latest gear. And they did it with materials they could make themselves, using knowledge passed hand to hand, generation to generation, for thousands of years. That knowledge still exists. It lives in the hands of elders who still tan, hides the old way. It lives in the memories of people who learned from their grandparents. It lives in the techniques that have been preserved, practiced, and passed forward. And it lives in the land itself, in the cedar trees that still offer their bark.
Wind's rising fast.
In the animals that still carry fat and fur. In the wind that still blows and the rain that still falls. The techniques are still there, still valid, still effective. They're waiting for anyone willing to learn them. Not as historical curiosities or museum pieces, but as living, functional knowledge that could save your life if you ever need it. Because the weather doesn't care about your technology. It doesn't care about your waterproof jacket or your synthetic insulation or your credit card. It will test you the same way it tested people 1,000 years ago. And when that test comes, the knowledge that kept them alive might be the knowledge that keeps you alive too. 7 techniques, simple in principle, profound in application: oil waterproofing, bark fiber layers, fur worn outward, layered buckskin, grass padding, smoke curing, wind and movement. Not one perfect solution, but a system, adaptable, flexible, combining multiple techniques into something greater than any single method. This is survival wisdom. This is traditional knowledge. This is what humans can accomplish when they pay attention to the world around them and learn from 10,000 years of experience. The storm passes, the sun returns, but the knowledge remains, patient and enduring, waiting in the cedar groves and the smoke lodges and the hands that still remember. If you want to walk deeper into these old ways, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel, and we'll continue exploring the techniques that kept people alive when staying alive was the only thing that mattered. Share this with someone who understands that true wisdom isn't invented, it's remembered.